Hello guys, Dr. Spooks here. If you enjoy my videos, please click the like button. It's the only way YouTube's algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. The first thing Jack noticed was the cold, sharp and biting, more intense than anything he'd ever felt. He opened his eyes, and the vast canopy of stars stared back at him, their light fractured by the silhouettes of towering pines. Jack blinked hard, confusion gripping him like a vice. He was lying on damp earth, the smell of moss and decay thick in his nostrils. A low breeze swept through the forest, rustling branches like whispers exchanged among unseen watchers. He pushed himself upright, his breath visible in the frigid air. His muscles ached, and his palms stung as he brushed dirt and pine needles from his hands. A quick glance around revealed nothing but endless trees. The silence was unnatural. No chirping insects, no distant calls of nocturnal animals, just the faint hum of the wind. Jack's heart raced. The last thing he remembered was sitting around a campfire with his friends. They'd been laughing, toasting marshmallows, and trading ghost stories. He tried to recall details, but his mind was a blur. How had he gotten here? Why was he alone? As he rose to his feet, his foot nudged something soft. He looked down and saw a deflated pool float, its shark-shaped form sagging pitifully against the ground. Jack frowned. It was completely out of place, a glaring anomaly in the natural setting. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. There was no explanation for its presence, just like there was no explanation for his. A flutter of movement caught his eye. Something was pinned to the bark of a nearby tree. Jack approached cautiously, the sound of his own footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet. It was a piece of paper, weathered and torn, held in place by a rusted nail. Written on it in messy, uneven handwriting were the words, "Come find us." Below the message was his name, scrawled in shaky letters. His stomach dropped. The handwriting was eerily familiar, his own, but he didn't remember writing it. His hands trembled as he pulled the note from the tree, the edges disintegrating between his fingers. He checked his pockets for his phone, a flashlight, anything, but found only more questions. His belongings were gone. He spun in a slow circle, scanning the forest for any sign of his friends. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing strangely, as if the trees themselves swallowed the sound. "Is anyone out there?" No answer, only the wind. Jack took a deep breath and forced himself to think logically. He'd probably wandered off in his sleep, maybe sleepwalking after one too many beers. That had to be it. He'd find his way back to the campsite, and his friends would be there, teasing him for getting lost. But as he picked a direction and began walking, a heavy sense of dread settled over him. The forest didn't feel right. The trees loomed closer together the farther he went, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Every step felt like a violation, as if he were trespassing in a place not meant for him. He kept walking for what felt like hours, his pace slowing as exhaustion set in. Just as he considered stopping to rest, his foot caught on something, sending him sprawling. He groaned, pulling himself upright and turning to see what had tripped him. It was another note, partially buried in the dirt. Jack's stomach churned as he picked it up. The words were smudged but legible. "We're not far. Hurry." This time the handwriting wasn't his. 2 days earlier, Jack had been standing on the edge of a sun-drenched trailhead, staring up at the vast expanse of wilderness before him. The Sierra National Forest stretched as far as the eye could see, a tapestry of rugged peaks and deep valleys. His friends were already unloading gear from the car, their voices filled with the excitement that comes with escaping the grind of daily life. "Last chance to back out, Jack," Emma teased, slinging a heavy backpack over her shoulder. Her auburn hair gleamed in the sunlight, and her easy smile hinted at how much she enjoyed ribbing him. Jack smirked, adjusting the straps of his own pack. "And miss all this? No way." "You say that now," Chris chimed in as he wrestled with a tent bag. "But wait until the second night when we're eating instant noodles and you're wishing for Wi-Fi. I'm just here for the campfire s'mores," Beth added with a grin. She was the smallest of the group, but carried the most enthusiasm, bounding ahead on the trail like an overexcited puppy. Jack wasn't a camping enthusiast, but he enjoyed the camaraderie. It had been Emma's idea, a way to celebrate Beth's recent promotion and disconnect from technology for a weekend. Jack, Emma, Chris, and Beth had been friends since college, their bond weathering the years despite their diverging lives. They'd spent countless nights in apartments and dive bars together, but this was their first time venturing into the wilderness as a group. The hike to the campsite was challenging but rewarding. The trail wound through dense forest, crossed over sparkling streams, and opened up to breathtaking vistas. The group laughed and joked as they climbed, their voices echoing through the trees. By the time they reached their destination, a secluded clearing beside a glacial lake, they were sweaty and tired but exhilarated. "This is perfect," Emma said, dropping her pack with a satisfied sigh. The lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, framed by towering pines and granite cliffs. They set up camp quickly, pitching their tents in a loose circle and gathering wood for a fire. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but he chalked it up to nerves. The forest had a way of amplifying every creak and rustle, and he wasn't used to being so far from civilization. That night they sat around the campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces. Chris produced a flask of whiskey, which they passed around as the stars emerged in the inky sky. Laughter filled the clearing as they swapped embarrassing stories and recounted their favorite college antics. As the fire burned low, the conversation turned to ghost stories. Beth was the first to share, her eyes wide as she described the urban legend of the Goat Man, a cryptid said to stalk campers in remote areas, mimicking their voices to lure them away from safety. Emma followed with a tale about hikers disappearing in the Appalachian wilderness, their bodies later found miles from their last known location, their faces frozen in terror. Jack didn't contribute. He'd never been one for scary stories, preferring logic and reason to the supernatural. But as the others spoke, he couldn't ignore the prickling at the back of his neck, the way the forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive beyond the firelight. Eventually, Beth yawned and declared it was time for bed. One by one, the group retreated to their tents, the warmth of the fire replaced by the chill of the night. Jack lay on his sleeping pad, staring at the nylon ceiling of his tent. The rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl should have been comforting, but he couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, he thought he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and unnervingly close. He froze, straining his ears, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. It was probably one of his friends heading to the bushes, he told himself. Still, sleep didn't come easily. The morning sun filtered through the trees, warming the forest floor and banishing the eerie sensations of the previous night. Jack stepped out of his tent, stretching as the fresh air filled his lungs. Emma was already up, crouched near the fire pit, coaxing flames from the embers. Beth was still in her tent, and Chris was perched on a log, munching on a granola bar. "Sleep okay?" Chris asked, tossing Jack a bar. Jack caught it and nodded, though he wasn't entirely truthful. "Yeah, no complaints." After a quick breakfast, they packed light and decided to explore the area around the lake. The trail leading away from the campsite was faint, more of a suggestion than a path, and they followed it eagerly. As they climbed a small ridge, the view opened up to reveal the lake's far shore, a serene and untouched landscape of rock and water. The group marveled at its beauty, snapping photos and skipping stones. About an hour into their hike, Beth stopped abruptly. "Did you guys see that?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "See what?" Emma asked, stepping beside her. Beth pointed to a break in the trees ahead. "There's something over there. It looked like a tarp or something." The group moved cautiously toward the area Beth had indicated. As they pushed through the underbrush, they came upon an old campsite, abandoned and in ruins. A tattered tarp hung limply from a tree, its faded blue fabric fluttering in the breeze. Nearby, the rusted frame of a portable stove lay half buried in dirt, alongside a scattering of utensils and unidentifiable debris. "This is creepy," Emma muttered, glancing around. Chris knelt beside the remains of a campfire, poking at the charred logs. "This stuff's ancient. Look at this. Probably been here for years." Jack walked toward a cluster of overturned coolers and gear, his curiosity growing. As he knelt to examine a discarded hiking boot, something caught his eye, a Polaroid photo lying face down in the dirt. He picked it up and turned it over, his breath hitched. The photo showed a group of people standing in front of a campfire, their faces partially obscured by shadows. Jack's attention zeroed in on the figure at the far right, tall with short dark hair and a familiar jacket. It was unmistakably him. "What is it?" Emma asked, noticing his expression. Jack hesitated, then handed her the photo. She frowned as she studied it. "Wait, is this—" "Me," Jack finished, his voice tight. "But I've never been here before." "Okay, that's weird," Chris said, standing. "Like, really weird. Are you sure you didn't—" "I'm sure," Jack interrupted, frustration creeping into his tone. "I've never been to this campsite in my life." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's just keep going," Beth said, her earlier excitement replaced by a nervous edge. "This place is giving me the creeps." They left the abandoned camp behind, but the mood had shifted. Even Chris, usually the skeptic, seemed unsettled. Jack couldn't stop thinking about the photo. It was old, yellowed and frayed around the edges, but the resemblance to him was undeniable. As they continued hiking, the forest seemed to grow darker, the canopy thickening overhead. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, and every sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, felt amplified. When they reached the top of a ridge, the group stopped to catch their breath. The view below was stunning, rolling hills blanketed in forest, with the glint of the lake in the distance. But Jack barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the image in the Polaroid. "Do you think someone's messing with us?" Beth asked, breaking the silence. Emma shook her head. "How could they? We just got here." Jack didn't respond. He didn't want to admit the thought swirling in his head, that whoever had left the photo wasn't just someone. They were still out there, watching. By the time the group returned to their campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the clearing. The forest seemed quieter than it had earlier in the day, and even the familiar sound of the lake's gentle lapping against the shore felt subdued. They moved quickly, gathering wood for the fire and preparing a simple dinner of instant noodles and trail mix. Jack couldn't shake the unease that had been growing since they found the Polaroid. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking at the edge of the trees. He didn't say anything, though. The last thing he wanted was to come off as paranoid, especially when he wasn't sure what he'd seen or felt. As the fire crackled to life, the group tried to recapture their earlier enthusiasm. Beth recounted a funny story about a disastrous hiking trip she'd taken with her older brother, and Emma chimed in with her own tales of clumsy outdoor adventures. Even Chris, who rarely let his guard down, seemed more relaxed as they shared laughter under the canopy of stars. But Jack couldn't join in. His eyes kept drifting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest seemed alive, not with the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures, but with something quieter, something watching. He clenched his hands into fists, willing himself to stay calm. "It's just the woods," he told himself, "just your imagination." As the night wore on, the group's energy dwindled. Chris and Beth retreated to their tents first, leaving Jack and Emma by the fire. She was poking at the embers with a stick, her face thoughtful. "You've been quiet tonight," Emma said, not looking up. Jack hesitated, then sighed. "I just can't stop thinking about that Polaroid. It doesn't make sense." Emma nodded. "Yeah, it's weird, but maybe it's just some crazy coincidence, like maybe it's someone who looks like you." "Maybe," Jack said, though he didn't believe it. They sat in silence for a while, the firelight dancing across their faces. Then Emma stood, stretching. "I'm gonna call it a night. Don't stay up too late." Jack watched her disappear into her tent. then turned his attention back to the fire. He added another log, the flames flaring brightly for a moment before settling back into a steady crackle. The warmth was comforting, but the sense of unease lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As he sat there staring into the fire, a sound cut through the quiet. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling flames, a rhythmic, almost deliberate rustling in the underbrush. Jack froze, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the campsite. He grabbed the flashlight lying next to him and stood, sweeping the beam across the trees. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling slightly. "Who's there?" No response, just the rustling, steady and unrelenting. Jack's grip on the flashlight tightened. He took a step toward the edge of the clearing, his heart hammering in his chest. "This isn't funny," he said, louder this time. "Show yourself." The rustling stopped. Jack held his breath, straining to hear any other sounds. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, he let out a shaky breath and turned back toward the fire. And then he saw it. Just beyond the firelight, at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood motionless. It was barely more than a shadow, its outline indistinct but unmistakably human. Jack's blood ran cold. He took a step back, raising the flashlight to shine it at the figure. But there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. "Jack?" He nearly jumped out of his skin at the sound of Emma's voice. She was standing just outside her tent, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked groggily. Jack opened his mouth to explain, but stopped. What could he say? That he thought he'd seen someone, but now they were gone? He shook his head. "Nothing. Just thought I heard something." Emma frowned but didn't press him. "Come to bed. You're freaking yourself out." Jack nodded, though he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. As he crawled into his tent, he couldn't shake the image of the figure at the edge of the clearing. And he couldn't help but feel that it was still out there, waiting. Morning arrived, shrouded in mist, the air damp and heavy. Jack awoke to the sound of hushed voices outside his tent. He unzipped the flap and stepped out, greeted by Emma and Chris sitting near the extinguished fire pit. Beth was pacing near the lake, her arms crossed tightly. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Emma looked up, her expression tight. Beth thought she heard something last night. Footsteps, close to her tent. Jack's stomach sank. "Did you see anything?" Beth stopped pacing and shook her head. "No. When I looked, there was nothing there. But I know I heard it. It was deliberate, not just an animal." Chris sighed, rubbing his temples. "Probably just a raccoon or something. Let's not freak ourselves out." Jack didn't say anything. He didn't want to add to the tension, but he knew what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen the night before. "Maybe we should stick together today," he said finally. "No splitting up." "Agreed," Emma said. "Let's just get out and hike. Maybe some daylight will make us all feel better." They packed up a small bag of essentials and set out along a trail that skirted the edge of the lake. The mist clung stubbornly to the forest, muffling their footsteps and turning the world into an eerie, dreamlike landscape. Jack kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again. The group didn't speak much, their earlier camaraderie replaced by a heavy silence. Even Chris seemed subdued, his usual sarcastic remarks conspicuously absent. After about an hour of walking, they came to a fork in the trail. One path led uphill, winding through dense trees, while the other descended into a shallow valley. "Which way?" Beth asked, her voice unusually quiet. "Downhill," Chris said, pointing. "We haven't explored that area yet." Reluctantly, they followed him down the sloping trail. The trees grew thicker as they descended, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural canopy. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, until it felt as though they were walking into another world entirely. Jack was the first to notice the smell. It was faint at first, but as they went deeper into the valley, it became stronger. Cloying and sickly sweet, like rotting meat. "What the hell is that?" Emma muttered, covering her nose with her sleeve. The group slowed, their unease mounting with every step. The smell grew stronger until it was nearly unbearable. Then the trail opened up into a small clearing, and they saw it. A sinkhole. It yawned in the center of the clearing, a jagged tear in the earth. The edges were overgrown with weeds and tangled roots, but the bottom was visible. A pit filled with discarded belongings. Backpacks, sleeping bags, and clothing lay scattered like the remnants of a campsite. But it was the other objects that made Jack's skin crawl. Animal bones, half buried in the dirt, their yellowed surfaces gnawed and splintered. "What is this place?" Beth whispered, her voice trembling. Jack stepped closer to the edge, his heart pounding. He could see old camping gear tangled with the bones, torn tents, rusted stoves, and a collapsed folding chair. But it was the Polaroids that caught his attention. They were scattered across the bottom of the sinkhole, some half buried in the dirt, others fluttering in the faint breeze. He squinted, his breath hitching as he realized they were all pictures of people, campers, hikers, and him. "Oh my God," Emma said, taking a step back. "We need to leave, now." Chris, usually the calmest of the group, nodded. "Yeah, this is messed up." As they turned to go, Jack's foot slipped on the loose dirt at the edge of the sinkhole, sending a small cascade of debris tumbling into the pit. The sound echoed unnaturally, amplified by the hollow space below. He froze, his eyes darting to the shadows at the bottom. Something moved. It was subtle at first, a flicker of motion among the debris. But then it grew, a dark shape slithering and rising, unfolding with unnatural grace. Jack's breath caught in his throat as two glinting eyes emerged from the shadows, locking onto him. "Run," he whispered. The group didn't need to be told twice. They bolted back up the trail, the forest seeming to close in around them as they fled. Jack didn't dare look back, but he could hear it. The sound of something climbing out of the sinkhole, something large and impossibly fast. By the time they reached the fork in the trail, the sound was gone. But the forest felt different, heavier. Jack leaned against a tree, trying to catch his breath, his mind racing. "What the hell was that?" Beth gasped, clutching Emma's arm. Jack didn't answer. He didn't know. The group trudged back to camp in silence, each step weighed down by a growing sense of dread. No one spoke about the thing they had seen, or thought they'd seen, emerging from the sinkhole. The forest felt oppressive now, the air thick and suffocating. Every crackle of leaves or snap of a twig set their nerves on edge. When they reached the clearing, Beth immediately collapsed onto a log near the fire pit, burying her face in her hands. "This trip was a mistake," she muttered. "We should have never come here." Chris paced near the tents, his face drawn and pale. "That thing, whatever it was, isn't normal. We need to pack up and leave, tonight." "It's too late," Emma said, gesturing to the horizon. The sun was already sinking below the trees, the sky streaked with hues of deep orange and purple. "We'd never make it out before dark." "Then we leave first thing in the morning," Jack said firmly. "We'll stick together, stay near the fire, and just get through tonight." The others nodded reluctantly, though no one looked convinced. They ate a quiet dinner of granola bars and jerky, the usual banter replaced by tense glances at the forest. Jack tried to stay calm, but his mind kept replaying the image of those glowing eyes at the bottom of the sinkhole. What had it been? And why had the Polaroids been there? Why had his face been among them? The fire burned low, its crackling the only sound in the clearing. One by one, the group retreated to their tents, each armed with a flashlight, and the promise to call out at the first sign of trouble. Jack lay on his sleeping pad, his hunting knife clutched tightly in one hand. He didn't think it would do much against whatever was out there, but it was better than nothing. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Jack tried to keep his breathing steady, but his senses were on high alert, every muscle in his body tense. He wasn't sure when he finally drifted off, but when he awoke, it was to the sound of rustling. At first he thought it was just the wind, but as he listened, he realized the noise was deliberate. Soft footsteps crunching over fallen leaves. He bolted upright, his heart racing. The sound was moving past his tent toward the others. "Guys," he whispered. but there was no response. He unzipped his tent slowly, gripping the knife tightly as he peered out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. Jack's eyes darted to Emma's tent, then Chris's. Both were still zipped shut, but Beth's tent flap was wide open. "Beth?" Jack crawled out of his tent, his voice louder this time. "Where are you?" No answer. He moved toward her tent, the knife trembling in his hand. Inside, her sleeping bag was empty, crumpled as if she had left in a hurry. Her boots were gone, but her flashlight was still there, lying on its side and casting a weak beam across the nylon floor. "Beth!" Jack shouted now, waking the others. Emma and Chris stumbled out of their tents, their faces alarmed. "What's going on?" Emma asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Beth's gone," Jack said, his chest tight. "She's not in her tent." Chris swore under his breath. Maybe she just went to pee or something. "She would have taken her flashlight," Jack said, shaking his head. "And I heard footsteps. She didn't just wander off." Emma grabbed her own flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing. "Beth," she called, her voice echoing into the forest. "Where are you?" The only answer was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Jack's throat tightened. "We need to find her." Chris hesitated. What if that thing from the sinkhole?" "Don't," Emma snapped, her voice trembling. "Don't say it." Jack ignored them and stepped toward the tree line, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam caught a faint impression in the dirt, a trail of footprints leading into the woods. They were small, unmistakably Beth's, but something about them made Jack's skin crawl. The steps were erratic, as if she'd been running or dragged. "Here," Jack said, motioning to the others. "She went this way." Chris grabbed a branch from the fire, its smoldering tip casting weak light as they followed the trail. The forest seemed darker now, the air colder. The footprints led deeper into the trees, winding through dense underbrush and over uneven terrain. Every so often the group stopped to call out for Beth, but the only response was the rustling of leaves. After what felt like an eternity, the trail ended abruptly. The footprints disappeared, replaced by a patch of disturbed earth. Jack shone his flashlight over the ground, his stomach sinking. In the center of the clearing lay Beth's boot. One of its laces snapped and trailing into the dirt. "She wouldn't have left this," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. Jack crouched beside the boot, his mind racing. There were no other tracks, no sign of where she had gone or what had taken her. But as he reached for the boot, he noticed something else, a Polaroid lying half buried in the dirt. His hands trembled as he picked it up. It was a picture of Beth, taken from the edge of the campsite. She was smiling, her face lit by the glow of the campfire. Jack turned the photo over, his heart pounding. On the back, written in smeared ink, were the words, "She's ours now." Jack stared at the Polaroid, the words on the back burning into his mind. "She's ours now." His hands trembled as he handed the photo to Emma, whose eyes widened in horror. Chris leaned in, his face pale as he read the words. "What the hell is this?" Chris demanded, his voice tight. "Who's doing this?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know, but someone's out here, watching us." "Someone? That wasn't a someone we saw climbing out of that sinkhole," Chris snapped. "And now Beth is—" He cut himself off, unable to finish the thought. Emma took a deep, shuddering breath. "We can't stay out here. We need to go back to camp, grab our gear, and get out of this forest." Jack glanced back the way they'd come, dread pooling in his stomach. The trees seemed to press closer now, the darkness between them impenetrable. "What if they're watching the camp?" Emma swallowed hard. "We'll have to risk it. We can't stay out here without supplies." Reluctantly, the group began retracing their steps. Jack led the way, gripping his knife tightly. Emma followed close behind, clutching her flashlight, while Chris brought up the rear, still holding the smoldering branch. The forest was deathly quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their own footsteps crunching over dirt and fallen twigs. Every so often, Jack's flashlight would catch movement in the shadows, but whenever he focused the beam, there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the clearing where their camp lay. Jack signaled for the others to stop and crouched low, scanning the area with his flashlight. The fire pit was cold now, the tents dark and undisturbed, but something was wrong. "Do you see that?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack followed her gaze to the center of the clearing. A figure was standing there, its back to them. It was tall and thin, its posture unnaturally rigid. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence, just stood there, facing Beth's tent. Chris cursed under his breath. "What the hell is that?" Jack motioned for them to stay put and crept forward, his flashlight aimed at the ground to avoid drawing attention. As he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. The figure wasn't wearing clothes. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched too tightly over an emaciated frame. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening for something. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his ears. Slowly he raised the flashlight and aimed the beam at the figure. It turned. Its face was hollow, its eyes sunk in black pits that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Jack stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Run!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure lunged toward him with inhuman speed, its limbs moving unnaturally as it closed the distance. Jack bolted, the others screaming as they followed. The forest exploded with noise, branches snapping, leaves crunching, their panicked breaths mixing with guttural, inhuman sounds from behind. They ran blindly, the flashlight beams bouncing wildly. The creature was fast, its heavy, uneven footsteps closing the gap no matter how fast they ran. Jack veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate attempt to lose it. Emma and Chris followed, their terrified cries echoing in the darkness. Suddenly, the ground dropped away beneath Jack's feet. He tumbled down a steep incline, his body slamming into rocks and tree roots before coming to a stop at the bottom. Pain shot through his ribs, but he forced himself to his feet, wincing. His flashlight was gone, leaving him in near total darkness. "Emma, Chris," he called, his voice hoarse. No answer. Above him, the forest was still. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence. Jack's heart pounded as he strained to listen, every nerve in his body on edge. Then, faintly, he heard it. A whisper. "Jack?" It wasn't Emma. It wasn't Chris. It was Beth. Jack froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice, it was Beth's, but distorted, stretched thin like it had been dragged through static. His breath caught as he scanned the darkness around him. The incline he'd tumbled down was steep, the underbrush dense and tangled. If Beth was down here, how had she gotten there? And why did her voice sound so wrong? "Beth?" Jack called, his voice trembling. "Where are you?" The forest didn't answer. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves. Jack's hands shook as he patted his pockets, searching for his flashlight. But it was gone. He cursed under his breath and took a cautious step forward, his knife gripped tightly in his hand. Then he heard it again. "Jack?" This time the voice was closer, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Jack's stomach churned. It wasn't just the tone that was wrong, it was the cadence. Beth had a distinct way of speaking, a rhythm to her words that wasn't there now. This voice was a parody of hers, like an echo that had learned to mimic but didn't understand. "Beth, if that's you, say something else," Jack demanded, his voice louder now, tinged with desperation. Silence, then a response. "Something else." Jack's blood ran cold. The words were hers, but the tone was all wrong, hollow and mocking. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a root. He barely managed to stay upright, his eyes darting frantically through the trees. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. A soft laugh echoed through the woods, low and guttural. It wasn't Beth's laugh. It wasn't human. Jack turned and ran, his feet slipping on the uneven ground as he clawed his way up the incline. His lungs burned, his muscles screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't Beth, and it was toying with him. As he reached the top of the incline, he nearly collided with Emma and Chris. They were out of breath, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. "Jack!" Emma gasped, grabbing his arm. Are you okay? We heard you screaming. There's something down there, Jack said, his voice frantic. It sounded like Beth, but it wasn't her. It was copying her. Chris's eyes widened. Copying her? What the hell does that mean? I don't know, Jack admitted, his voice shaking, but we need to keep moving. It's close. Emma nodded, her grip on Jack's arm tightening. Which way? Jack glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The forest looked the same in every direction, a maze of shadows and twisted trees. Then he spotted a faint light in the distance, flickering through the trees like a will-o'-the-wisp. There, Jack said, pointing. It's light. Maybe another trail or a campsite. Or another trap, Chris muttered. But he followed as Jack and Emma began moving toward the light. The light grew brighter as they approached, resolving into the glow of a campfire. Relief surged through Jack, but it was quickly replaced by unease. The fire burned in a small clearing, but there were no people, no tents, no signs of a campsite. Just the fire, crackling merrily in the center of an otherwise empty space. What is this? Emma whispered, stepping closer. Chris grabbed her arm. Don't go near it. Jack scanned the clearing, his grip on the knife tightening. Someone's here. They have to be. Then he saw them. Polaroids, dozens of them scattered around the fire. Jack's chest tightened as he knelt to pick one up. It was Beth, her face frozen in a smile, standing at the edge of the forest. He grabbed another. This one showed Chris leaning against a tree with a wary expression. A third photo sent a chill down Jack's spine. It was of him, taken only moments ago, as he crouched beside the fire. Jack, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was pointing to the opposite side of the clearing. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, its pale, emaciated form hunched and unnatural, its head tilted, those sunken black eyes fixed on Jack. Then it smiled, a grotesque grin that stretched far too wide. And it spoke. Jack? The voice wasn't Beth's anymore. It wasn't anyone's. It was an amalgamation of sounds, distorted and fractured, like a broken radio trying to tune itself. Jack stumbled back, dragging Emma and Chris with him. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and wrong like a marionette controlled by clumsy hands. Its grin widened as it reached out, long fingers clawing at the air. Run! Jack shouted, his voice raw. They turned and fled, the creature's laughter following them into the woods. Branches whipped against Jack's face as he sprinted through the forest, his breath ragged and his legs screaming in protest. Emma was just ahead, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly through the darkness. Chris trailed behind, his footfalls heavy and uneven. The creature's laughter followed them, an unnatural fractured sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jack didn't dare look back. He could hear it moving, its jerky, deliberate steps tearing through the underbrush, growing louder and louder. Faster! Jack yelled, his voice hoarse. Emma turned abruptly, veering onto a faint game trail that snaked between dense clusters of trees. Jack followed without hesitation, the narrow path forcing them into a single file. The terrain grew steeper, and the underbrush thickened, clawing at their clothes and slowing their pace. Behind them, the laughter stopped. Jack skidded to a halt, his chest heaving as he strained to listen. The forest was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Emma and Chris stopped too, their wide eyes darting around the shadows. Do you hear it? Emma whispered. Jack shook his head. The absence of sound was worse than the laughter. It meant the creature was hunting silently now, moving through the forest like a phantom. His grip on the knife tightened, the handle slick with sweat. What do we do? Chris asked, his voice low and frantic. Jack scanned the forest, his mind racing. We keep moving. If we stay still, it'll find us. Emma hesitated, then nodded. Which way? Jack pointed uphill. The incline was steep, but it offered a vantage point, a chance to see the creature coming. They climbed in silence, the forest closing in around them. The air felt heavier here, colder, as if the woods themselves were alive and hostile. At the top of the ridge, they stopped to catch their breath. The view was limited, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. Jack glanced at Emma and Chris, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. We can't just keep running, Emma said, her voice trembling. It's faster than us, smarter than us. We need a plan. Jack's mind raced. The creature seemed to thrive on fear, toying with them like a predator enjoying the hunt. It had lured Beth away, left the Polaroids, and driven them into the woods. But why? What did it want? Then it hit him. The sinkhole. That thing came from the sinkhole, Jack said, his voice urgent. It was protecting it. What if that's its territory? What if we lure it back there? Chris stared at him. Lure it back? Are you insane? That thing will kill us. It's already hunting us, Jack shot back. At least this way we have a chance. The sinkhole is deep. If we can get it to fall in, maybe we can trap it. Emma's brow furrowed. How do we get it to follow us? Jack held up one of the Polaroids he'd grabbed from the fire. It's obsessed with us. It's been watching us, stalking us. If it sees us heading back to the sinkhole, it'll come after us. Chris looked unconvinced, but Emma nodded. It's worth a shot. We can't keep running forever. Reluctantly, Chris agreed, and the group began making their way downhill, moving quickly but carefully. Jack led the way, keeping his flashlight low to avoid drawing attention. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees towering like sentinels. As they neared the sinkhole, the air grew colder, the smell of decay wafting on the breeze. Jack's stomach churned as they entered the clearing. The sinkhole yawned before them, a black void filled with the detritus of countless victims. They stopped at the edge, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Jack scanned the forest, his heart pounding. The creature wasn't far. He could feel its presence, a malevolent force lurking just out of sight. Then, from the shadows, it emerged. The creature stepped into the clearing, its pale, emaciated form illuminated by the moonlight. Its eyes were black voids, its grin impossibly wide. It moved with a predatory grace, its head tilting as it studied them. Jack raised the Polaroid. "You want us?" he shouted. "Come and get us!" The creature's grin widened, and it let out a low, guttural laugh. Then it charged. Jack and the others darted to the sides of the sinkhole, their footsteps skidding on the loose dirt. The creature moved faster than Jack expected, closing the distance with terrifying speed. It lunged for him, but he rolled out of the way, its claws swiping inches from his face. "Over here!" Emma shouted, waving her flashlight to draw its attention. The creature snarled and turned toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Emma backed away, leading it toward the edge of the sinkhole. At the last second, she dove to the side. The creature couldn't stop in time. It teetered on the edge, its claws scrabbling at the dirt as it tried to regain its footing. Jack didn't hesitate. He rushed forward and shoved it with all his strength, sending it tumbling into the void. The creature let out a bone-chilling scream as it fell, its voice echoing through the forest. Then there was silence. The group stood at the edge, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sinkhole was still now, the darkness swallowing the creature whole. "Did we?" Chris began, but he couldn't finish. "I think we did," Jack said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma stepped back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Let's get out of here now." The three of them didn't speak as they fled the sinkhole, the oppressive forest pressing in on all sides. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of fear through them, but the creature's piercing cries had ceased, replaced by an unnatural silence. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor. The first glimmers of dawn filtered through the trees as they finally stumbled back into their campsite. It felt like a lifetime ago that they had laughed around the campfire, their biggest worry being who had packed the marshmallows. Now the clearing was a desolate reminder of what they had lost. Beth was gone, and the remaining three were shadows of the people who had started this trip. Emma collapsed onto a log, her head in her hands. Chris stood near the cold fire pit, his face pale and drawn. Jack remained on the edge of the clearing, staring back at the trail they had emerged from, half expecting to see the creature lurching after them. "We need to go," Emma said, her voice breaking the silence. "As soon as possible, before anything else happens." Jack nodded. "Let's pack what we can and leave." We'll go straight back to the car and get help." Chris didn't move. He was staring at something near the edge of the clearing. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is that?" Jack and Emma turned, their stomachs sinking. At first it looked like just another Polaroid lying face up in the dirt. But as Jack approached it, his heart pounded in his chest. It was a picture of the three of them, taken from above, as they stood at the edge of the sinkhole. "That's impossible," Emma said, her voice trembling. How?" Jack picked up the Polaroid, his hands shaking. There was something written on the back in the same smeared ink as before. "Not yet." The air seemed to grow colder. The shadows of the trees stretched unnaturally long, creeping toward them like fingers. Jack's mind raced. The creature couldn't have survived the fall. Could it? "We have to go," he said, his voice tight. "Now." The group scrambled to pack their gear, abandoning anything that wasn't essential. The clearing seemed to darken with each passing second, the forest closing in around them. Jack led the way, his knife in hand, as they started down the trail toward the car. The journey was grueling, every sound amplified by their heightened senses. But as they pushed forward, the forest began to thin. The light grew brighter, and Jack felt the first stirrings of hope. Then he heard it. A laugh, low and guttural, rising from somewhere deep in the forest. Jack froze, his blood turning to ice. Emma and Chris stopped too, their faces pale with terror. "It's still out there," Chris whispered, his voice shaking. "No," Jack said, his voice firm. "It's not following us, it's letting us go." Emma frowned. Why would it do that? Jack didn't answer. He didn't want to admit what he was thinking, that they hadn't escaped, not really. The creature had let them leave because it wanted them to, because it wanted to watch them suffer. When they finally reached the car, they threw their gear inside and climbed in, slamming the doors shut. Jack started the engine, the sound breaking the suffocating silence. As they sped down the dirt road, the forest seemed to watch them, its dark eyes hidden in the shadows. It wasn't until they reached the highway that Jack allowed himself to breathe. But even as the miles stretched between them and the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't left it behind. In his pocket, the Polaroid burned like a brand, a constant reminder of the message scrawled on its back. Not yet. The creature wasn't finished with them, and deep down Jack knew it never would be. I went on the dark web, and something weird is happening to me right now. Hello Reddit, my name is Andon. I am 23 years old. I am still in college. My good friend Justin introduced me to the dark web. He mentioned it to me for the first time. I learned how to access it on my own. Even though I knew how to go on the dark web, I never tried to. Until one day Justin was saying to me how much good stuff he finds there. He was interested in paranormal stuff. And he was talking about all the leaked ghost videos, all the ghost photos. They were uncensored and unedited. He was saying that everything you see on the dark web is probably true. And these kind of stories I've heard from him more than 1,000 times, if I am being honest. So, one day when I was home alone and I was bored, that feeling came to me. You know that feeling when you know you shouldn't do something, but you still want to do it, because you want to see what will happen. And it got the best of me. I downloaded the browser Tor and a VPN. For those of you who don't know, you need the Tor browser to access the onion links. On the onion links you can find anything you are looking for. Let's be real legal and not so legal stuff, but you need to know what exactly you are looking for. And a VPN is short for virtual private network. And what VPN does it is, let's just say for example, you are online from somewhere in America and you connect to a network in Japan. Then if someone tries to track you, it will show them that you are somewhere in Japan. In simple words, that is how it works. Then I finally launched the Tor browser. And finally I was on the dark web. There were all these weird links, just links, nothing more. All I could see were links. I wasn't looking for anything specific, so I just started randomly clicking on links one after another. And I started typing random stuff on the search bar as well. Most of the links I clicked were dead ends. When I say dead ends, I mean they were just simple texts. Maybe they were of importance, but I was too lazy to read that. Occasionally, I would come across a creepy and disturbing image or video. I've seen worse, to be honest. And after about an hour, I was considering shutting down the browser, and before I did, I came across this weird website or link. It was like a text site where you can chat with someone only using texts. I don't know exactly why I decided to pick a fight with someone. Maybe I was feeling too secure because of the VPN. I was using a laptop at the time, and yes, I did not cover my camera. So I started chatting with a stranger. I typed, "Hey bitch." Stranger typed, "Ha ha ha, really?" Me, "Yeah, what are you gonna do?" Stranger, "Kid, go to bed and don't mess around with stuff you don't need to mess with." Me, "Ask your mom if I was a kid." This conversation I gave you is a bit censored version of our conversation. I used a lot stronger language in the actual chat. Then in one moment I noticed on the camera like a green dot. Those of you who use laptops know there is like a small green light near the webcam when it is in use. So this meant my camera was working and possibly someone was watching. When I saw that, I shut down Tor and quickly my laptop as well. In my head, all I was saying is that I am stupid. I have seen tons of videos on YouTube saying you need to cover the camera and turn off the microphone, and I still forgot. And even I read hundreds of Reddit dark web stories. They also mentioned that I need to cover the webcam, and I still forgot. I'm dumb. I'm so dumb. But that night I went to bed a little bit scared, if I'm honest. The next morning I woke up and I went to college. On my way to college, I was nearly run over by a black Audi car. I think it was an Audi. It was driving too fast and I couldn't see good enough. When I was in the college, I quickly found Justin. I told him about what happened. He said, "Do not worry, dude. It's probably nothing and you are overthinking this." I said, "I really hope so." And I went to class. Classes were boring like most of the time, but after a while they were over and I went home. That day, nothing else happened. When I was at home, I grabbed something to eat, watching Netflix, and I went to bed early. The next morning when I woke up, I noticed that someone who wasn't from the neighborhood was checking my house. I could see him clearly. I had big glass wall, and from outside to the inside you can't see anything. But I brushed it off. I went to wash my face, brush my teeth, and eat something before I went to college. I arrived there safely without anything happening. I told Justin about the man and he said, "Dude, you really need to chill. You're way too much in your head. You're overthinking this stuff. Just breathe and chill." I said okay, and we parted ways with Justin. I went to my classes, and he went to his. Like I said, classes were boring, and after a few hours they were done. Me and Justin stayed behind in one of the classrooms. We do this a lot. We are the only ones left by this time. We just sit down and have a talk. Or sometimes we even play games on our Nintendo Switches. It was getting dark and we decided to go home. Justin lived in totally opposite direction from me. So while I was going home, when I was crossing the street on the crosswalk, it happened again. A car tried to run me over again. But this time it was way too close. If I didn't jump in time, this time I think I would be dead. Actually, it hit my leg a little bit. I don't think it was the same car though, but it already happened twice. I wasn't sure what to think anymore. Scared, I went home fast. That is when I am typing this Reddit. What do you think? Is it because of that dark web fight? Am I on someone's hit list? Is it because I forgot to cover my webcam? Do you think someone is trying to finish me for real? If you have any clue, please leave a comment, because I really want to know what you think. And if I should go to the police, and if I go to the police, will I get in trouble because I was on the dark web? Does someone know? Anyone had similar experience? I really hope no one had similar experience. But if someone really did, please leave a comment because it is life and death situation, I think. Please leave a comment and see you soon. It was a regular Friday night when my friend William started talking about the dark web. We were just hanging out at his place, a small, cluttered apartment. The light from his laptop was the only thing brightening the room, and the air smelled like old pizza and some weird incense he liked to burn. You ever heard of the dark web? William asked, looking at me with this excited, almost weird look in his eyes. I shrugged, taking another sip of my beer, which had gone warm by now. Yeah, I've heard stuff, mostly like drugs, hitmen, that kind of thing, just urban legends, right? William shook his head and leaned in closer, dropping his voice like he was about to tell me a big secret. Nah, man, it's real. And it's not just that. There are some crazy things on there if you know where to look. Stuff that can change your life. I raised an eyebrow, now genuinely curious. Like what? Like necromancy. I couldn't help but laugh a little. Necromancy. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. But William was dead serious, his face showing no sign of a joke. Necromancy? Like bringing back the dead? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and not sound like I was mocking him. William nodded. Yeah, I found this book once. It was on this hidden forum, buried deep. It was in some old language, but there were parts translated. It had detailed rituals, spells, the whole deal. It's creepy, but fascinating. The idea of necromancy grabbed my attention right away. Not just because it was spooky, but because I had a personal reason. My dog Max had died recently, and it hit me hard. The thought of bringing him back, even if it sounded crazy, was too tempting to ignore. How do you even get on this dark web? I asked, trying to sound casual. You need a special browser called Tor, William explained. It lets you access it anonymously. Once you're on, you can find all sorts of hidden forums and websites. It's like a maze, but if you know where to look, you can find some really interesting stuff. That night I couldn't stop thinking about what William had said. The idea of the dark web, with its hidden knowledge and forbidden practices, kept swirling around in my mind. By morning, I had made up my mind. I had to see it for myself. I spent the next few days researching how to access the dark web. I learned that Tor, short for the Onion Router, anonymizes your identity and location by using layered encryption. I downloaded the Tor browser and spent hours reading guides and watching videos on how to navigate this hidden part of the internet. When I finally opened Tor for the first time, I felt a rush of excitement and a bit of fear. The browser was simple, almost bare compared to the flashy ones I was used to. I ended up on a search engine called DuckDuckGo, which I knew was known for protecting privacy. From there, I clicked on link after link, diving deeper into this digital underworld. The forums I found were a mix of weird and mundane. There were discussions on everything from conspiracy theories to hacking. But I had one goal: finding the necromancy book William had talked about. After nights of searching, I finally found a thread that looked promising. It was in a forum dedicated to the occult, hidden deep within the dark web. The title was in Latin, but the rough translation was something like The Secrets of the Dead. My heart started racing as I clicked on the link. The post was a detailed guide on necromancy, with translated excerpts from an ancient text. The author, using the handle Shadow Reaper, claimed to have performed several successful rituals. The descriptions were very vivid, almost too real, describing dark ceremonies and forbidden rites. As I read through it, a mix of excitement and fear washed over me. The idea of raising the dead was both fascinating and terrifying, but the more I read, the more I wanted to try it. There were detailed instructions on everything from summoning spirits to reanimating corpses. One passage in particular stood out. To bring back a lost pet, one must first gather the remains. If none are available, a personal belonging of the deceased may suffice. The ritual must be performed under a new moon, with offerings of blood and bone. I shuddered at the thought, but I couldn't deny how much I wanted to try it. Max's death had left a huge hole in my heart, and the idea of seeing him again, even just once, was too tempting. I printed out the guide and started preparing. The new moon was only a week away, and I wanted to be ready. I gathered everything I needed: a lock of Max's fur, a few of his favorite toys, and a small vial of my own blood. My friends and family noticed I was acting different, more withdrawn, but I brushed off their concerns. I couldn't explain what I was planning. They'd think I was crazy. The night of the new moon finally came. I waited until midnight, the time when the veil between the living and the dead is supposedly the thinnest. I lit candles and arranged the items in a circle, following the instructions exactly. The air felt thick with tension as I started chanting the incantations, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and hope. For what felt like hours, I repeated the words, focusing all my thoughts on Max. When I finished the final chant, a cold wind blew through the room, snuffing out the candles. I held my breath, listening for any sign that the ritual had worked, but there was nothing. Just silence and darkness. A mix of disappointment and relief washed over me. Maybe it was all just nonsense. Maybe I had been foolish to think I could meddle with such dark forces. As I started to clean up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I had no idea then that this was just the beginning of a journey into darkness. The days after my first attempt at the ritual were really weird. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, but I didn't know what. I kept thinking about Max and the ritual, going over it in my head again and again. Had I missed something? Was there a step I didn't do right? One evening, I was cleaning out my closet and found an old box with Max's things in it. It was tough going through it, seeing his favorite toys, his collar, and his old blanket. At the bottom of the box, I found Max's old leash. It was worn and frayed from all the walks we used to go on. Holding it brought back so many memories, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. I remembered that the guide said if you didn't have remains, you could use something that belonged to the deceased. This leash was perfect. Max used it every day. If anything could make the ritual work, this had to be it. I decided to try the ritual again. The next new moon was only a few days away, so I started getting ready right away. I gathered the same items, a lock of Max's fur, his favorite toy, the vial of my blood, and now his old leash. This time I was determined to follow the instructions exactly. I couldn't afford any mistakes. The night of the new moon came, and I felt both excited and scared. I waited until midnight again, making sure everything was ready. I arranged the candles in a circle and placed the items inside. The air felt thick with tension, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath and began chanting the incantations. My voice was steadier this time, filled with purpose. I focused all my thoughts on Max, picturing him in my mind as I repeated the words. The room seemed to grow colder, and I felt a strange energy building around me. As I finished the final chant, the candles flickered and went out, just like before. I stood there in the dark, holding my breath, listening for any sign that the ritual had worked. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard a faint, familiar sound. It was a soft whimper, like the one Max used to make when he wanted attention. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the sound. In the dim light, I could just make out a shape moving toward me. It was small and shadowy, but as it came closer, I could see it more clearly. It was Max's leash, floating in the air as if being pulled by an invisible force. My breath caught in my throat as the leash floated toward me, stopping just a few inches away. "Max?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no response, but the leash floated gently up and down, almost like a nod. Tears welled up in my eyes as I reached out to touch it. It felt real, solid, just like it always had. The feeling of the worn leather in my hand brought back a flood of emotions, but as I held the leash, a sense of unease began to creep over me. This wasn't the happy reunion I had imagined. There was something off about the whole thing. The air felt heavy, and the room seemed darker than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had opened a door to something I didn't fully understand. The leash floated back to the ground and the room fell silent again. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something else to happen. But there was nothing. Just stillness and darkness. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. I had felt Max's presence, I was sure of it. But it hadn't been right. There was a darkness to it, something that made my skin crawl. The next day I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to the ritual, to the feeling of the leash in my hand. I knew I had to try again, but I also knew I had to be more careful. There was something dangerous about this, something I didn't fully understand, but I couldn't stop now. I had to bring Max back no matter the cost. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the ritual. It was driving me crazy. I kept going over the instructions, trying to figure out what I might have done wrong. I was so close to bringing Max back, but something was off. One evening, I decided to look at the guide again. I spread out the printed pages on my kitchen table and started reading. I went through each line carefully, making notes and highlighting anything important. That's when I found something I had missed before. Near the bottom of one of the pages, in really small text, was a note about needing a specific time and event for the ritual. It said something about performing the ritual under a full moon at exactly 3 a.m. I couldn't believe I had missed it. It was such a small detail, but it seemed crucial. I checked my calendar and saw that the next full moon was only a week away. This time, I was determined to get everything right. I gathered all the items again. Max's fur, his favorite toy, the vial of my blood, and his leash. I also made sure I had candles and a clock to keep track of the time. The night of the full moon finally came. I was nervous but also hopeful. I waited until just before 3 a.m., making sure everything was set up perfectly. The candles were in a circle, and the items were placed exactly as the guide described. I double-checked everything to make sure I didn't miss any detail. At exactly 3 a.m., I started chanting the incantations again. My voice was steady, filled with determination. I focused all my thoughts on Max, picturing him clearly in my mind. The room grew colder, and I felt that strange energy building up again. This time I knew I had everything right. I was sure of it. As I finished the final chant, the candles flickered and went out, just like before. I stood there in the darkness, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, just silence and darkness. I waited for what felt like hours, hoping for some sign, any sign, that the ritual had worked. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the heavy stillness of the room. I felt a crushing sense of disappointment and frustration. How could it have failed? I had followed every instruction, every tiny detail. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of the ritual, feeling defeated. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept replaying the ritual in my mind, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. It didn't make sense. I had done everything right. But there was no sign of Max, no sign that the ritual had worked at all. I spent the next few days in a fog, unable to shake the feeling that I had missed something again. But what? I had followed every instruction, down to the smallest detail. It didn't add up. Despite my frustration, I knew I couldn't give up. Max meant too much to me. I had to find a way to make this work, no matter how long it took or what I had to do. But for now, all I could do was wait and hope that I would find the missing piece of the puzzle. The days after my second attempt at the ritual were really tough. I was so sure I had done everything right, but nothing happened. It didn't make any sense, and it was driving me crazy. I kept thinking about it, trying to figure out where I went wrong. One evening, out of pure frustration, I decided to go back to the dark web forums. Maybe I missed some important piece of advice, or overlooked a crucial detail. I logged into Tor and started browsing the forums, where I found the necromancy book. After a bit of searching, I found a thread discussing the same book I had been using. People were talking about their experiences, and my heart sank as I read through the comments. "This book is a complete scam," one user wrote. "I tried the rituals and nothing happened. It's all fake." "Yeah, I wasted weeks on this crap," another user replied. "None of it works. It's just a bunch of made-up nonsense." I kept scrolling, feeling a pit growing in my stomach. Comment after comment confirmed my worst fears. The book was fake. All the rituals, all the instructions, everything. It was all a lie. I felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over me. I had put so much hope into this, spent so much time and effort trying to bring Max back, and it was all for nothing. The realization hit me hard, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the screen. I didn't know what to do. I felt lost and defeated. Max was gone and nothing I did could change that. The dark web, the necromancy book, it was all just a cruel joke. I decided then and there to give up. I had to accept that Max was gone and move on. It wasn't easy, and the pain of losing him still lingered, but I knew I couldn't keep chasing false hopes. I needed to let go. The next few days were rough. I tried to distract myself with work and other activities, but my mind kept drifting back to Max and the rituals. I felt foolish for believing in something so far-fetched, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. Eventually, I started to come to terms with it. I began to focus on the good memories I had with Max, remembering the happy times we spent together. It was hard, but it was the only way I could move forward. I stopped visiting the dark web, deleted all the files related to the necromancy book, and put away Max's belongings. It was time to let go and try to heal. It wasn't easy, and the sadness still crept in from time to time, but I knew I had to keep moving forward. In the end, I realized that some things are just beyond our control. No matter how much we want something, sometimes we just have to accept reality and find a way to live with it. It was a tough lesson to learn, but it was one I needed to understand. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, I started to feel a bit better. I spent more time with friends and family, and they helped me get through it. They didn't know the whole story, but they knew I was hurting and needed support. Looking back now, I see how desperate I was to hold on to Max. I understand why I went to such lengths, even if it seems crazy now. Sometimes grief makes us do things we wouldn't normally do. I know Max would have wanted me to be happy, to move on and remember the good times we had. Life goes on, even after we lose the ones we love. It's not easy, and it takes time. But eventually the pain starts to fade, and we find a way to keep going. Max will always be a part of me, and I'll always cherish the memories we shared. After accepting that the necromancy book was fake, I tried to move on with my life. But sometimes, I still found myself checking the dark web, hoping for some new information. It was hard to let go of the hope that I could bring Max back. One night, out of nowhere, I got a message on the dark web. The username was DarkSeeker42. The message said, "Hey, I saw your posts about the necromancy book. I managed to do the ritual successfully. It worked." My heart started racing. Could this be real? Could someone else have figured it out? I replied quickly, asking for more details. DarkSeeker42 responded almost immediately, telling me he had brought back his cat using the same book. He gave me some details that sounded convincing, and I felt a flicker of hope. We messaged back and forth for a while. I asked him how he did it, what steps he followed, if he did anything different from the book. He gave me some new tips and claimed that timing and certain chance were crucial. He seemed so genuine, and I wanted to believe him. But as the conversation went on, I started noticing inconsistencies in his story. Some of his tips didn't match anything in the book or the forums I had read. My gut feeling started telling me something was off, so I pushed a little harder, asking for proof. I wanted to see a video or even a picture of his revived pet. That's when his responses became evasive. He started making excuses, saying he didn't have a camera or couldn't send a video. It felt like he was stalling. Finally, after a lot of back and forth, he sent me a blurry, obviously photoshopped picture of a cat that didn't even look real. I confronted him, telling him that the picture was fake and asking why he was messing with me. After a few minutes of silence, he replied, "You're too easy, man. It's just a prank. Get a life." I felt a wave of anger and sadness. I had let myself get pulled back in by false hope. It was like ripping open a wound that had barely started to heal. But this time, instead of wallowing in it, I felt a sense of finality. That's when I knew I had to let Max rest in peace. I couldn't keep chasing these shadows and getting hurt over and over again. Max was gone, and no ritual or dark web trick could bring him back. I had to accept that. I stopped visiting the dark web altogether. I deleted my accounts and got rid of everything related to the necromancy book. I put away Max's things, keeping only a few mementos that reminded me of the good times we had. It wasn't easy, but I started focusing on the future. I spent more time with friends and family, finding comfort in their support. I even adopted a new dog from the shelter. He didn't replace Max, but he brought new joy into my life. Letting go of Max was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. He wouldn't have wanted me to be stuck in a cycle of grief and false hope. He would have wanted me to be happy and to remember him with a smile. In the end, I learned that some things are just meant to stay in the past. We can't change what's gone, but we can cherish the memories and move forward. Max will always be a part of me, and I'll always remember the love and joy he brought into my life. It's time to let him rest and for me to live my life, embracing both the past and the future. So about 2 weeks ago, it was a Saturday night. My roommates were out and I had the place to myself. I was bored and had a few beers. I've always been curious about the dark web. Not for anything illegal, just to see what it was like. You hear so many stories about it. I've got some tech skills, so I set up my VPN, launched Tor, and started browsing. At first, it was kind of boring. Just forums, weird marketplaces, and conspiracy sites. But then I found this link that looked different. Just a string of random letters and numbers. I clicked on it thinking it was just another site. The page loaded, and it was all black except for one line of white text in the middle. Welcome to the theater. There was a button that said Enter. I know I should have closed it, but I didn't. I clicked Enter. The screen flickered, and then a video feed started. It showed a dark room with a wooden chair in the middle. No one was there, but it gave me a bad feeling. Before I could think too much, a chat box popped up next to the video. Do you want to see a show? Someone typed. I hesitated, but then replied, Sure. The video changed angles, showing a close-up of the chair. A hooded figure stepped into the frame holding something. They put it on the chair and then backed away. The thing on the chair was a laptop. Its screen flickered, showing quick flashes of images. I felt uneasy but couldn't look away. Then the images stopped and the screen went black. I thought it was over, but then a new image appeared. It was a live feed of my living room. I was sitting right there looking at the screen. My heart stopped. I turned to look behind me, but everything was normal. When I looked back at my laptop, the feed was gone, replaced by another message. We see you. I freaked out. I shut my laptop and yanked the power cord out. My heart was racing and I felt like I was going to puke. What had I just seen? Was it a prank? But how did they get into my camera? My webcam was covered and I was careful about my security. I couldn't sleep that night. Every noise made me jump. I kept my phone close, ready to call 911. But nothing happened. Eventually, I dozed off from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was a bad dream. I checked my laptop for malware, but everything seemed fine. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For the next few days, I was on edge, double-checking locks and looking over my shoulder. 3 days later, a package arrived. It was a plain cardboard box, no return address, just my name and address in messy red ink. My stomach dropped. I took it inside and opened it. Inside was a single photograph of me taken through my living room window. I was sitting at my laptop just like that night. My face was circled in red with an X over it. I dropped the picture and backed away. Then I heard a soft tapping on the window. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart was pounding. Someone had been outside my house, close enough to take that picture. They wanted me to know they were watching. I checked the locks again and even put a chair in front of the door. I spent the day in a daze, jumping at every sound. That night I barely slept. Around 3 a.m. I heard the tapping again. This time I didn't look. I knew no one would be there. I peeked through the blinds, but everything seemed normal. Still, I felt like someone was watching me. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus at work, and I was constantly on edge. I even thought about moving, but I didn't know if that would help. Whoever this was, they had found me once. And then, things got worse. After I got that creepy package with my photo, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I was constantly checking the locks, peeking through the blinds, and feeling uneasy. It started with small things. I noticed a car parked across the street that wasn't usually there. Sometimes I'd see someone walking by my house who seemed to be lingering a bit too long. One night, I was driving home from work. It was around 10 p.m. I work late, and the drive home is usually quiet. But this night, I noticed a car behind me that seemed to be following me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. I decided to test it. I drove past my house and made a few random turns. The car followed me every time. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go home and let them know where I lived. So I drove to a nearby grocery store that was still open and parked there. The car drove past and didn't stop. I waited a few minutes, then headed home, constantly checking my mirrors. When I got home, I locked all the doors and went to bed with my phone in my hand, ready to call 911. The next day, I installed some security cameras around my house. I needed to feel safe, and I hoped that having cameras would catch something if this kept happening. A few days later, I was getting ready for work in the morning. I checked the security footage from the night before. Around 2 a.m., the camera facing the street caught someone standing across the street, just staring at my house. They were there for almost an hour. It was the same hooded figure from the video. I called the police and showed them the footage. They took a report but said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They promised to patrol the area more often, but that didn't make me feel much better. The next few days were the same. I noticed the same car following me home a couple more times. Sometimes I'd see the hooded figure standing a few houses down, just watching. It felt like they were trying to scare me. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. I heard a noise outside my window. It was a soft scraping sound, like someone was dragging something against the side of the house. I froze, listening. The sound moved around the house, stopping and starting again. I grabbed my phone and called 911. I whispered to the operator what was happening. They sent a patrol car to my house. When the police arrived, they searched the area but didn't find anyone. They told me they'd keep an eye out, but it was clear they thought I was overreacting. I felt helpless. Someone was out there stalking me and no one could do anything about it. I started taking different routes home, always looking over my shoulder. I told my roommates what was happening and they were freaked out too. We started double locking everything and keeping the lights on at night. One evening I got home from work and there was another package waiting for me. This time it was a small plain envelope. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a photo of my house taken from the street. Written on it, in red ink, were the words, "See you soon." That was it. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend across town. I felt bad leaving my roommates, but I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified. I still don't know who is doing this or why. Every day I feel like I'm looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next thing to happen. I don't know how much more I can take. I'm scared for my life. After moving in with my friend, I thought I'd feel safer, but I was still paranoid, always looking over my shoulder and checking the locks. My friend thought I was being too cautious, but I couldn't help it. I knew someone was out there, watching me. One evening, I had to go back to my place to pick up some stuff. My friend offered to come with me, but I told him I'd be fine. It was still daylight, and I thought it would be a quick trip. I parked my car in the driveway and hurried inside. I grabbed my things and was about to leave when I noticed a dark van parked a few houses down. I hadn't seen it when I arrived, and it gave me a bad feeling. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a contractor or someone visiting a neighbor. I took a deep breath and walked out to my car, trying to act normal. But as soon as I stepped outside, the van's engine started. My heart was pounding. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder. The van started rolling slowly toward me. I made it to my car and fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the lock. I finally got the door open and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. Just as I started the engine, the van stopped right behind my car, blocking me in. Two men jumped out of the van, both wearing black masks. They started banging on my windows, trying to open the doors. I was panicking, but I managed to throw the car into reverse, slamming into the front of their van. It jolted them back just enough for me to shift into drive and speed away. I was shaking so much I could barely drive. I called 911 and told them what happened. They told me to keep driving and head to the nearest police station. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, expecting the van to be right behind me, but it wasn't. When I got to the police station, I told them everything. They took my statement and said they'd send a patrol car to my house to check things out. They also said they'd keep an eye out for the van, but they didn't seem too hopeful. I didn't go back to my friend's place that night. Instead, I stayed at the police station for a while, trying to calm down. My friend came to pick me up, and I told him everything. He was freaked out, but tried to stay calm for my sake. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about those masked men and what they might have done if they'd caught me. I was scared out of my mind. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next thing to happen. I still don't know who's behind all this or why they're targeting me. It feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from. I'm scared to be alone, scared to go home, scared to even step outside. After the kidnapping attempt, I was a wreck. I was scared all the time, jumping at every little noise. My friend tried to help, but I felt like I was putting him in danger too. I had to figure out why this was happening to me. So I did something I never thought I'd do again. I went back on the dark web. I know it sounds crazy, but I needed answers. I set up my VPN, launched Tor, and started browsing again. This time I was super careful. I went back to some of the forums I'd seen before, looking for anything that might explain why I was being targeted. After hours of searching, I found something that made my heart sink. It was a post on a hidden forum, a place where people hire others to do illegal stuff. There was a post about me. Someone had put up my picture, my address, and a reward for anyone who could finish the job. They were offering a lot of money. I felt like I was going to throw up. Someone was paying people to come after me. This wasn't just a random stalker. This was organized, and it was serious. I printed out everything I found and went straight to the police. I showed them the posts, the screenshots, everything. The officer seemed concerned at first, but then he told me there wasn't much they could do. He said they didn't have the resources to track people on the dark web, and that these threats were hard to trace. They promised to patrol my area more, but I could tell they didn't think they could help me much. I was on my own. I went back to my friend's place, feeling more hopeless than ever. I couldn't stay there forever, but I didn't feel safe anywhere. I spent hours trying to come up with a plan. I thought about moving far away. But what if they found me again? I thought about hiring a private security firm, but I couldn't afford it. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, thinking someone was breaking in. Every time a car drove by, I thought it was them. My friend tried to reassure me, but I knew he was scared too. I decided to go back online and see if I could find out who posted the hit on me. Maybe if I could figure out who was behind this, I could find a way to stop it. I spent days digging through forums, following leads, and trying to get information. I found a few clues, but nothing solid. It seemed like the person who posted the hit was using fake accounts to cover their tracks. They were smart and knew how to stay hidden. But I couldn't give up. My life depended on it. I started reaching out to people on the forums trying to get more information. Most of them ignored me or told me to get lost, but a few were willing to talk. I learned that these kinds of hits weren't uncommon, and that the people who took them on were dangerous and desperate. I didn't know what to do next. I felt like I was running out of options. Every day I was looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack. I was scared to leave the house, but I was also scared to stay. I'll keep digging and see if I can find anything else. If anyone has any advice or knows how to deal with this kind of situation, please let me know. I'm scared and don't know what to do next. After I found out there was a hit on me, I knew I couldn't stay in one place. The police couldn't help much, and I didn't have anywhere safe to go. I decided I had to leave town and go on the run. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I felt like I had no choice. I packed a bag with some clothes, my laptop, and anything I thought I might need. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I just left. I drove for hours, not really knowing where I was going. I just needed to get as far away as possible. I've been moving from place to place ever since. I never stay in one spot for more than a few days. I sleep in cheap motels, sometimes even in my car. I use cash for everything and try to stay off the grid. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always afraid that someone might recognize me. I try to stay connected online to see if there's any news about me. I check the forums to see if anyone is still talking about the hit. It looks like the posts have slowed down, but I can't be sure if that means they've stopped looking for me or if they're just being more secretive. Living like this is exhausting. I'm always tired, always anxious. I don't feel safe anywhere. Every time I see a dark van or a hooded figure, my heart races. I can't relax, can't let my guard down. I miss my old life. I miss my friends, my home, my routine. But I know I can't go back, at least not until I'm sure the threat is gone. I'm scared that if I make one wrong move, if I slip up just once, they'll find me. I've thought about going to the media, telling my story to a reporter or something. Maybe if more people knew about what was happening, it would put pressure on the authorities to do something. But I'm afraid that might make things worse, might make me even more of a target. So for now, I keep moving. I don't know how long I can keep this up. It's not a life, it's just surviving. But until I figure out a way to stop this, it's the only choice I have. Thanks for listening and for all the support. If anything changes, I'll try to update again. But for now, I need to stay off the radar as much as possible. Hey Reddit, I've never shared this story before, and honestly, I've been too scared to. But after years of keeping it bottled up, I think it's time to get it off my chest. This all happened when I was 17, and I hope my experience will serve as a warning to others. Stay away from the dark web. I was your typical teenager, curious and a bit reckless. It all started with some friends talking about the dark web at lunch. They made it sound like an exciting, forbidden place full of mysteries and hidden treasures. The idea fascinated me, but it also scared me. Still, the allure was too strong, and I couldn't resist the temptation. One evening, while my parents were out and my younger sister was at a friend's house, I decided to give it a shot. I had read up on how to access the dark web, download Tor, find some onion links, and you're in. Simple, right? I followed the steps carefully, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. When I finally accessed the dark web, it was underwhelming. At first, it seemed like a bunch of sketchy eBay knockoffs and chat rooms, but as I dug deeper, I found more disturbing sites, things I won't even describe here. I was about to log off when I stumbled upon a forum. It was just a thread, innocently titled Dangerous Curiosity. The thread was full of horror stories, people who had gone too far, seen too much, and paid the price. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but there was one post that caught my eye. It was a video link, captioned, "Watch if you dare." Without thinking, I clicked it. The video was grainy, showing a man in a dark room, lit only by a flickering candle. He spoke in a language I didn't understand, but his eyes seemed to pierce through the screen, directly at me. Suddenly, the video cut out, replaced by text. "You've been marked." My heart pounded. I closed the browser and shut down my computer, hoping that would be the end of it. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just a stupid prank, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next day, things started getting weird. On my way to school, I almost got hit by a car. It swerved out of nowhere, missing me by inches. The driver didn't stop, just sped away. I was shaken, but I tried to brush it off as a coincidence. A few days later, I noticed a man in a black suit with a briefcase. He seemed to be everywhere I went. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but then he started getting closer. He never spoke, just watched. His presence sent chills down my spine. One evening, as I was doing homework, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Stop looking." I froze. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I checked my computer, and there was an email with no subject, just a single line. "We are watching." I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, that I was overreacting, but the fear was real, and it was growing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell my parents. They'd freak out, ground me forever. So I kept it to myself, hoping it would all just go away. But it didn't. Late one night, unable to sleep, I went back on the dark web. I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping to find answers. What I found instead was horrifying. My personal information, my name, address, school, even photos, plastered all over a site. The caption, "This one's marked." I slammed my laptop shut, feeling sick. Panic surged through me. This was no prank. I was in real danger. The next morning, I finally broke down and told my parents everything. They were furious. There was a lot of yelling, tears, and accusations. But eventually, their anger turned to fear. We went to the police, who took it seriously but told us there was little they could do. That's when we decided to move. My parents didn't want to take any chances. We packed up and left, hoping to start fresh somewhere far away from the nightmare I had unleashed. It was a hard lesson learned. Curiosity isn't always harmless, and the dark web is no place for a curious teenager. Hey Reddit, I'm back with part 2 of my story. Our new home was in a small town far from where we used to live. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knows each other. My parents thought it would be a fresh start, a safe haven. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few weeks after the move, I began receiving anonymous texts again. At first, they were just random numbers and symbols, things that didn't make sense, but then they became more coherent. "You can't hide," one message read. Another one simply said, "We see you." I showed my parents, who immediately contacted the local police. They said they'd look into it, but there wasn't much they could do. One night I was alone at home. My parents had gone out for dinner, trying to reclaim some normalcy. My sister was at a sleepover. I was in my room, trying to do homework, when I heard a noise outside. It was subtle at first, like a twig snapping. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it again, louder this time. I went to the window and peeked through the blinds. There he was, the man in the black suit, standing across the street, staring directly at my house. My heart leapt into my throat. I closed the blinds and backed away, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it was him. He had found us. I called my parents, frantic. They rushed home, and by the time they got there, the man was gone. My dad checked outside, but there was no sign of him. The police came again, took our statements, but without any concrete evidence, there was little they could do. They suggested we install security cameras, which we did the next day. Things were quiet for a while after that. The cameras gave us some peace of mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes on me. I started seeing the man in the black suit more frequently, at the grocery store near my school, even outside my bedroom window one night. Each time he vanished before anyone else could see him. One particularly eerie incident happened when I was at the library. I was working on a project when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around, expecting to see a classmate, but there was no one there. Just a slip of paper on the table with a single word written on it. Soon. Panic set in. I couldn't focus on anything. I left the library feeling like I was being followed the entire way home. That night I barely slept, jumping at every noise. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The final straw came when I received a package. There was no return address, and inside was a USB drive. Against my better judgment, I plugged it into my laptop. It contained a single video file. The video showed my family and me in our new home, going about our daily lives. The footage was clearly taken from outside our windows. The last frame was a close-up of my bedroom window with a message, "Time is running out." That was it. My parents decided we needed more drastic measures. We contacted the police again, and they put us in touch with a cybercrime unit. They started an investigation, but the process was slow. Meanwhile, we installed even more security, motion detectors, alarms, anything to make us feel safer. But the fear never went away. I realized that the dark web wasn't just a place you could visit and leave unscathed. It had real consequences, and I was living them every day. The terror was relentless, and I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Hey Reddit, thanks for sticking with me through this story. Here's part 3. After the terrifying experiences, we were desperate for answers and some peace. The cybercrime unit had taken over our case, and things were finally starting to move forward, though not in the way we had hoped. The investigation began with a deep dive into the dark web activity that had triggered this nightmare. The cybercrime team worked tirelessly to track down the source of the leaks and the identity of the man in the black suit. They found that my initial venture onto the dark web had led me to a particularly sinister group that thrived on tormenting curious souls like me. This group had sophisticated methods of tracking and intimidating their targets. One evening, we were visited by Detective Harris, the lead investigator. He sat us down and explained that this group was known for using advanced hacking techniques to gather personal information. They would then use this information to terrorize their victims, often driving them to extreme measures. The good news was that they had managed to identify several members of the group and were working on shutting them down. The bad news was that it would take time, and they couldn't guarantee our safety until then. Days turned into weeks as the investigation continued. We remained on high alert, our nerves frayed from the constant fear. Despite the security measures, the man in the black suit continued to appear. Each time he seemed bolder, more threatening. The police increased patrols in our neighborhood, but it did little to ease our minds. One night the fear became unbearable. I woke up to the sound of our alarm blaring. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and called 911. My parents and sister were already in the hallway, panic etched on their faces. We waited, huddled together until the police arrived and searched the property. They found nothing, but I knew he had been there. I had seen his shadow outside my window just before the alarm went off. The next morning, Detective Harris called with an update. They had arrested several members of the group and had retrieved information that might help us. He assured us that they were closing in on the man in the black suit. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. A few days later, we received another visit from Detective Harris. He had news, both good and bad. The good news was that they had managed to trace the man in the black suit. He was an enforcer for the group, responsible for the physical intimidation of their targets. The bad news was that he had gone into hiding, and they hadn't been able to catch him yet. Despite this, the arrests had disrupted the group's operations significantly. The cybercrime unit believed that without their enforcer, the remaining members would be less effective at carrying out their threats. We were advised to stay vigilant but reassured that the worst was likely over. The following weeks were tense but uneventful. The texts stopped and we no longer saw the man in the black suit. The police maintained a presence in our neighborhood, and slowly, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. We were still cautious, but the constant fear started to fade. The investigation continued, and eventually, Detective Harris informed us that they had dismantled the group entirely. Most of its members were in custody, and those who weren't had gone underground. While the man in the black suit remained at large, the threat he posed was greatly diminished. Hey Reddit, thanks for following my story. Here's part 4. After the cybercrime unit dismantled most of the group, we started to relax a bit, but our relief was short-lived. The man in the black suit, the enforcer, wasn't captured, and his presence loomed over us like a dark shadow. One night around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange noise downstairs. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. My parents' room was down the hall, and I could hear them stirring as well. Suddenly, the security alarm blared, its piercing wail echoing through the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. My parents rushed into my room, and my dad motioned for us to stay put while he went to check on my sister. I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, too deliberate to be my dad's. My blood ran cold. The man in the black suit had found us. The 911 operator was still on the line, trying to calm me down and assuring me that help was on the way. I could barely focus on her words, my attention riveted on the sounds of our home being invaded. The door to my room creaked open slightly, and I saw a shadowy figure in the hallway. The man was tall, his suit stark against the darkness. He stepped into the room, and in the dim light I could see his cold, expressionless face. He carried a briefcase, an odd detail that seemed even more sinister in the context. Just as he took a step towards me, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The man hesitated, his head snapping towards the window. In that moment of distraction, my dad burst into the room, wielding a baseball bat. The man in the suit turned to face him, but the sirens were growing louder, and he knew his time was up. He bolted, racing down the stairs and out the back door. Moments later, the police arrived, swarming our house and securing the perimeter. They searched the area but found no trace of him. The damage to our home was minimal, a broken window and a few scattered items, but the psychological toll was immense. The police stayed with us for the rest of the night, and Detective Harris arrived early the next morning. He reviewed the security footage, which clearly showed the man breaking in and prowling through our house. Harris was grim but determined. This incident had escalated things, and he assured us they would find the man. In the days that followed, we lived under police protection. An officer was stationed outside our house 24/7, and our home security system was upgraded yet again. The sense of normalcy we had started to regain was shattered. Every creak and groan of the house set me on edge, and I barely slept, constantly haunted by the image of the man in the black suit. Despite the fear, we were determined to reclaim our lives. My parents were supportive, trying to keep things as normal as possible for my sister and me. We talked more openly about our fears, and their strength helped me cope with my own anxiety. Detective Harris kept us updated on the investigation, and a few weeks later they finally caught a break. The man in the black suit was found hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He was arrested without incident, his briefcase containing detailed notes on our family and others he had been assigned to intimidate. With his capture, the nightmare finally started to fade. We were still cautious, still healing, but the immediate threat was gone. We worked on rebuilding our sense of security, slowly letting go of the constant fear that had gripped us for so long. Hey Reddit, thanks for sticking with me through this hell ride. Here's the final part of my story. After weeks of living in fear, the police finally caught the man in the black suit. He was found hiding in an abandoned warehouse, looking just as sinister as he did when he broke into our home. His capture brought a sense of relief, but we all knew there were still questions that needed answers. When the police interrogated him, they found his responses unsettling. He had a single cryptic explanation for his actions. He needed to pay me what he owes. That was it. No further details, no clarification. Despite extensive questioning, he refused to elaborate on what he meant by pay, or what he believed I owed him. It was clear he had no intention of providing any real answers. The police searched his belongings and found meticulous notes on me and my family, as well as information on other potential targets. It seemed he had been assigned by the dark web group to intimidate and terrorize us, but the exact reasons behind his fixation on me remained a mystery. With the evidence against him, he was swiftly charged and put in jail. His arrest marked the end of the immediate threat, but the psychological scars took longer to heal. My family and I were finally able to start moving forward, albeit with a heightened sense of caution. This experience taught me several crucial lessons, the most important of which I want to share with you all. Stay away from the dark web. The curiosity that leads people there can quickly turn into a nightmare. It's not a place for exploration or adventure. It's a haven for criminals, hackers, and malicious entities who have no qualms about ruining lives for their own amusement or gain. As life slowly returned to normal, we strengthened our bonds as a family, relying on each other to get through the lingering fear. We took comfort in knowing that the man in the black suit was behind bars, unable to harm us or anyone else. So, if you ever find yourself tempted to explore the dark web, remember my story. The dangers are real and the consequences can be far-reaching and devastating. Stay safe, stay informed, and most importantly, stay away from the dark web. I was 6 years old when I first stumbled upon the dark web. I know it sounds crazy, a 6-year-old navigating the internet's most dangerous corners. But it happened. My older brother, Jason, was a computer whiz, and one day while he was out, I managed to get into his room. His computer was on, and the curiosity of a little kid knows no bounds. I remember the screen vividly, a black background with cryptic symbols and eerie links. My fingers, tiny and hesitant, clicked on one of those links. A strange video started to play, grainy footage of a dark, empty room. I was fascinated and scared at the same time. Then suddenly the screen went black, and a message popped up. "I see you." I slammed the laptop shut, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I'd done or what I was looking at. I just knew it wasn't something I should have seen. I ran out of Jason's room, trying to forget the whole thing. But that night something changed. As I lay in bed, the usual shadows of my room seemed darker, more menacing. I tossed and turned, unable to shake off the uneasy feeling. Then, around midnight, I saw him for the first time. Outside my window, there was a man. He was tall, wearing a black suit and a white mask that covered his face entirely. At first I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. He was still there, standing motionless. Fear gripped me. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. I quickly pulled the covers over my head, my little heart beating so fast I thought it would explode. The next morning I tried to tell my parents. They brushed it off, saying it was just a bad dream. Jason laughed and said I was watching too many scary movies, but I knew what I saw. And the worst part? He came back the next night, and the night after that. Every night he stood there, just watching. He never moved, never tried to come closer. But his presence was enough to terrify me. I started to dread bedtime, my once safe room now a place of constant fear. I tried everything to get rid of him. I closed the curtains, but I could still feel his gaze. I even switched rooms with Jason one night, but the masked man was always outside my window. My school performance started to drop. Teachers noticed I was always tired, and my friends started to avoid me because I was acting so paranoid. I felt trapped in my own world of terror, and no one seemed to believe me. I began to question my sanity, wondering if the man was real or if I was losing my mind. One night I decided to confront him. I mustered all the courage I could and approached the window. My hands were trembling and my knees felt weak, but I had to know. As I got closer, I could see the details of his mask, a plain white face with hollow eyes. I stood there staring at him, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he remained silent and still. I yelled at him to go away, but there was no reaction. My parents came rushing in, asking what was wrong. When I pointed to the window, the man was gone. They looked at me with a mix of concern and frustration, urging me to stop these games. But it wasn't a game to me. It was real, and it was happening every single night. This went on for months. I became a shadow of my former self, haunted by the man in the mask. Then, one day, he was gone. Just like that, he stopped appearing. I hoped it was over, that I could go back to being a normal kid. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the end. The fear he had instilled in me lingered, a constant reminder that he could come back at any time. Years passed, and I tried to move on with my life. But the memory of those nights never faded. It was always in the back of my mind, lurking like a shadow. Little did I know, the truth about the man in the mask would eventually come to light, revealing a story far more disturbing than I could have ever imagined. Years went by, and the memory of the man in the mask became a ghost that haunted my past. By the time I turned 16, the nightly visits had become a distant, albeit unsettling, memory. I focused on school, friends, and trying to live a normal teenage life. But the shadows of those nights lingered, casting a long, dark shadow over my psyche. One evening, I was going through some old boxes in the attic, searching for a yearbook for a school project. Among the dusty relics of my childhood, I found Jason's old laptop, the one I had used to access the dark web all those years ago. Curiosity got the better of me, and I powered it on. To my surprise, it still worked. I navigated through the files, looking for any clue that might explain the man in the mask. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a hidden folder labeled Eyes Only. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a series of disturbing videos. Each one showed different angles of our house, all recorded at night. And there he was, the masked man, standing outside my window in every single clip. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This wasn't a figment of my imagination. He was real, and someone had been recording him. But who? And why? I took the laptop to my parents, showing them the videos. Their faces turned pale, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in their eyes. They immediately called the police. The investigation that followed was intense. Detectives combed through the videos, trying to piece together the identity of the masked man. Weeks turned into months, and I tried to stay calm, hoping for answers. Then, one day, I came home from school to find police cars outside our house. My parents were talking to an officer, their faces a mix of relief and shock. They had caught him. The man in the mask was a neighbor who lived just a few houses down. He had been stalking me for years, obsessed with my every move. The police found a shrine in his basement, filled with photos of me from different stages of my life. There were notes, too, detailing his plans and observations. It was horrifying. I felt violated, my sense of security shattered. But knowing he was behind bars brought a sense of relief. The nightmares, however, didn't stop. I would wake up in cold sweats, seeing his masked face in the darkness. Therapy helped, but it took years to rebuild my trust in the world around me. The scariest part of the whole ordeal was realizing how close he had always been. He watched me grow up, blending into the background of my everyday life. It made me question everyone and everything, never fully trusting my own perceptions. As I write this now, I still feel a chill when I think about those nights. The masked man is gone, but the shadows he cast over my childhood remain. My story is a reminder that sometimes the things we fear most aren't just in our heads. They can be all too real, just staying in the shadows outside our windows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The arrest of the masked man should have brought closure, but it only deepened the mystery. My family tried to move on, but questions lingered. How did he know so much about us? Why was he so obsessed with me? The police shared some details, but many aspects remained unclear. One day, a detective named Collins visited our house. He had been working on the case and wanted to share some findings. "We've discovered some disturbing evidence," he said, placing a thick folder on the kitchen table. Inside were more photos, journal entries, and maps of our neighborhood. It was clear that this man had been meticulously planning his every move for years. Collins explained that the stalker, a man named Richard, had an unhealthy fixation on the dark web. He had frequented forums and chat rooms where people discussed and shared their darkest fantasies. Somehow I had caught his attention during my brief, accidental visit to the dark web. The "I see you" message I had received was his way of marking me as his next target. Richard had been watching me ever since, but not just physically. He hacked into our home network, accessing our devices and gathering information about my daily life. The level of detail in his notes was chilling. He knew my favorite foods, my friends' names, even the routes I took to school. Collins assured us that Richard would be in prison for a long time, but he also advised us to take precautions. We upgraded our home security system, installed cameras, and became more vigilant about our online presence. The knowledge that someone had been able to infiltrate our lives so deeply was terrifying. Despite these measures, I found it hard to shake the feeling of being watched. I started noticing small things: a moved garden gnome, an unfamiliar car parked nearby, a flickering streetlight. My paranoia grew, making it difficult to distinguish between real threats and my mind playing tricks on me. One evening, as I was browsing through social media, I received a friend request from an unfamiliar profile. The profile picture was a simple black square, the username a series of random numbers. My heart raced as I accepted the request, curiosity getting the better of me. Almost immediately, I received a message. "Did you miss me?" Panic surged through me. I quickly blocked the profile and reported it to the police. Collins visited again, reassuring me that Richard was still in prison and that this was likely a copycat or someone trying to exploit my fears. Nonetheless, it reignited my anxiety. Therapy became a lifeline. I talked through my experiences, trying to make sense of the trauma. My therapist helped me understand that while Richard's physical presence was gone, the psychological scars he left would take time to heal. It was a slow process, but gradually I started to regain some semblance of normalcy. However, one question remained unanswered. How did Richard know to target me in the first place? Collins had a theory. He believed that someone from the dark web forum had given Richard my information. It was a chilling thought that there might be others out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to exploit innocent mistakes. As I moved forward with my life, I remained cautious, always aware of my surroundings. The dark web, once a distant and abstract concept, had left a permanent mark on my psyche. It was a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the most unexpected places and the importance of staying vigilant. A few years later, I was in college trying to live a normal life. The trauma of my childhood had faded into the background, though it never completely disappeared. One day, while studying in the library, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "We need to talk about Richard." My heart skipped a beat. Against my better judgment, I opened the email. It was from a woman named Sarah, claiming to be a journalist investigating cases like mine. She had uncovered new information about Richard and wanted to meet. At first, I was skeptical and hesitant, but curiosity and the need for closure convinced me to agree. We met at a quiet cafe near campus. Sarah was in her mid-30s with a determined look in her eyes. She laid out her findings, revealing that Richard was part of a larger network of stalkers who communicated and shared information on the dark web. My case wasn't an isolated incident. There were others, victims like me, who had been targeted by this group. Sarah had been researching this network for years, trying to expose them and bring them to justice. She showed me files and documents that painted a grim picture of how these individuals operated. They traded personal information, discussed their targets, and even shared tips on how to avoid detection. One piece of information stood out. Richard had a mentor, someone who had introduced him to the dark web and guided him through his stalking activities. This mentor was still out there, possibly orchestrating new targets. Sarah believed that by collaborating, we could help the authorities shut down this network. I felt a mix of fear and determination. The idea of facing this darkness again was daunting, but I couldn't stand the thought of others going through what I did. I agreed to help, providing Sarah with all the information I had about my encounters with Richard. Together we worked tirelessly, piecing together the web of connections. We identified other victims and gathered evidence to present to the police. Sarah's persistence paid off. The authorities launched a thorough investigation, leading to several arrests and the dismantling of a significant part of the network. During this time, I learned more about Richard's past. He had been a troubled individual with a history of mental health issues. His obsession with the dark web had consumed him, turning his life into a twisted nightmare. Understanding his background didn't excuse his actions, but it helped me find some semblance of closure. The investigation brought a sense of justice, but it also opened old wounds. I struggled with anxiety, reliving the fear and helplessness of my childhood. Therapy became crucial once again, helping me navigate these emotions and rebuild my sense of security. One night, as I sat in my dorm room, I received another email from Sarah. "We've done it," she wrote. "The network is dismantled, and the mentor is in custody." Relief washed over me, but so did a profound sense of exhaustion. The battle had been long and arduous, but we had made a difference. Reflecting on everything, I realized that my journey wasn't just about overcoming fear. It was about reclaiming my life and helping others find their strength. The masked man had taken so much from me, but he had also unknowingly set me on a path of resilience and advocacy. As I continued with my studies and moved forward, I remained vigilant. The dark web and its horrors were still out there, but I had faced my demons and emerged stronger. My story, once a source of fear, had become a testament to the power of courage and the importance of standing up against the darkness. The network's dismantling and the arrest of Richard's mentor marked a significant turning point in my life. With the immediate threat removed, I was finally able to breathe easier. But the journey wasn't over yet. Healing is a process, and I was still in the midst of it. I threw myself into my studies, finding solace in routine and the pursuit of my passions. The more I immersed myself in my coursework and extracurricular activities, the more I felt like I was reclaiming the years I'd lost to fear. I even started volunteering at a local community center, sharing my story and helping others understand the importance of online safety. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling volunteer session, I received a call from Detective Collins. He had become a friend and mentor through all of this, offering support and guidance. "I have good news," he said. "The last of the individuals involved in the network have been sentenced. It's finally over." The weight that had been pressing on my shoulders for so long lifted. The chapter of my life dominated by Richard and his dark web associates was finally closing. I thanked Collins, tears of relief streaming down my face. As the months passed, I continued to work on my mental health, focusing on building a future untainted by my past. I graduated with honors and landed a job in cybersecurity, driven by a desire to protect others from the same dangers I had faced. It felt like a full circle moment, turning a childhood nightmare into a career dedicated to safeguarding others. My family and I grew closer through this ordeal. They had been my rock, even when they didn't fully understand the depth of my fear. We made a pact to always listen to each other, no matter how unbelievable our concerns might seem. Trust and communication became the foundation of our relationship. Every now and then, memories of the masked man would resurface, but they no longer held the same power over me. I had confronted my fears head-on and had come out the other side stronger and more resilient. I learned to see my past not just as a source of pain, but as a well of strength and determination. I also stayed in touch with Sarah, who had become a close friend. Together, we started an awareness campaign about the dangers of the dark web, giving talks at schools and community centers. Sharing our knowledge and experiences became a way to channel our trauma into something positive, ensuring others wouldn't fall prey to the same horrors. One day, while preparing for a talk, I received a letter. It was from one of the other victims we had helped during the investigation. "Thank you," it read. "Your bravery saved my life." It was a simple message, but it meant the world to me. It was a reminder that, despite the bad, there is always some good in the world left.